Now, moving on, is it right to expect struggling taxpayers to contribute to more and more of their salary to fund government spending commitments? That's the question.
Inflation is skyrocketing, and a key priority for the next Prime Minister will likely be to get a grip of public spending and looking for any cuts in government that can be made.
Yes, well, one think tank claims that reforms to bargaining in the public sector could save up to £9 billion in spending per year. £9 billion of taxpayers' money, of course.
The Taxpayers Alliance claims that a localised rather than a nationwide pay system would mean that rises would no longer be uniform across large sections of the public sector, saving taxpayers money.
Yes, well, joining us now is Darwin Friend, who's a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you for joining us. I've got your report here in front of me, but can you just summarise for those watching and listening just what you found in this report and where these savings that you speak of could be found?
Yes, well, thank you firstly for having me on the show. And what we've found is that there's currently public sector pay is largely determined at a national basis. So many of your viewers will be aware that there are these things called pay review bodies, which deals with the pay for public sector workers such as nurses, teachers and the police. And then there are also these single status agreements, for example, for council staff, which largely follow government policy. And the issue is that what these things do is they mean that pay for public sector workers across the entire country is decided centrally, not taking any account of the cost of living in the particular area they may be working and living in. And so what we're recommending is to change that, focusing on a more local basis of pay bargaining for public sector workers, so that then the cost of living in those local areas are taken account in the amount of pay that public sector workers receive.
It's an interesting point you make, but as a think tank, you write these sort of policy suggestions to try and give them to the government, and the government picks it up and says, well, yeah, that's a good idea, we're going to run with this. But surely this smacks in the face of levelling up, saying that, well, if you're from a poor part of the country, you should be paid less.
Well, actually, what we found in the paper, Alex, is the fact that, for example, in lower cost regions, the fact that public sector pay is so high is actually stopping even higher employment because, for example, the private sector is crowded out because they simply can't compete with the level of wages that the public sector is paying. And so what we're actually saying is if they were more reflective of the cost of living in those areas, what it'd actually do is boost employment and prosperity in those regions, because it's going to mean more investment by businesses boosting the private sector rather than being dominated by the public sector as they currently are.
Not a risk that you would potentially precipitate some sort of flight. You know, say if you're a nurse and you're earning X amount of money in the northeast and you could earn a little bit more if you were to move to the southwest, for example. Do you not think that a nurse who doesn't have, you know, responsibilities or attachments to that region might think, well, I'm going to go down south, I get more money there?
Well, that's potentially the issue, but that's not what we're seeing at the moment. What we're seeing actually in the South is the fact that they're having to spend billions of pounds on expensive agency staff because they can't recruit people. And that's the issue that we're facing at the minute. I think in the NHS hospitals alone, it was £2.4 billion a year they spent on agency staff in the recent 3 years. And so what this would actually do is mean that pay is then reflective. So then, yes, it may be higher in higher cost regions, and that may then mean that the amount of reliance on agency staff is reduced. But I think what we need to remember about this overall isn't the fact that it's about cutting public sector pay. It's about making it fairer for private sector workers as well, who are ultimately going to be paying for all of this through the record high tax burden. And so I think if pay was decided on a more local basis, it's a fairer system then. It's going to even out the disparity, which is currently around about 20 billion between the public and private sector workers, and it makes it more affordable for taxpayers, saving them £9 billion almost.
I wonder if what we're seeing at the moment, we're seeing lots of unhappy public sector workers. We're seeing those who can strike. Of course, there are sectors which can't legally strike. But would changes like this, sort of this drive to save taxpayer money by sort of moving down the rate of wage increases, wouldn't we see more dissatisfaction in public services? And essentially, it could risk public services becoming worse than they already are.
Well, I think what we're actually seeing at the moment in public sector pay is the median public sector wage is 14% higher than the private sector. And I think what we should be talking about right now is, rather than higher public pay and going on strike if not, I think we need to be talking about tax cuts. We've got a 70-year high tax burden. And if we want to deliver higher pay for people working in this country, the easiest way to do that right now is to cut taxes for hardworking people, leaving them with more of their own money in their pockets right now.
Like that. Right now, I assume when it comes to the two leadership candidates who seem to be arguing not so much on cutting taxes, Rishi Sunak now going to town on cutting taxes, but about when to do it. Do you agree with Liz Truss that it needs to be immediate, or Rishi Sunak's school of thought, which is, yes, it needs to happen, but if we did it right now, it'd make matters even worse?
Well, we're not taking any particular view on any candidate in this leadership election. But what we would say is taxpayers are really struggling right now. I mentioned the record high tax burden. We've got inflation at its highest level since the 1990s. And so I do think taxpayers need support right now, with bills going up for energy, fuel, and also them just not being able to keep more of their own money because of the tax burden. And so what I would say is that the government should be going for growth right now. And the way they could do that, for example, is bringing forward and doubling the income tax cut that they've announced. They could also abolish the NI increase that's happened, and also cut VAT to 17.5%. And what that's going to do is not only leave more money in people's pockets, as I mentioned earlier, but it's also going to boost growth and investment in this country, all of which we desperately need right now.
And just very finally, I'm really interested in a table you've got here in the report. It's the largest pay rises offered by government departments. This is from 2019 to 2020. And I'm looking at a figure that surely cannot be right. It says here that in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, for example, the highest percentage pay rise was 68.5%, which is a cash value of 22 grand. Can you just explain that to us?
Yeah, so what it is that the average pay increase in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs was around about 2.5%. But what they can also do is give one-offs, for example, to certain civil servants. And so that's a 68.5% rise, as you mentioned, £22,000 of taxpayers' money going to one person when we're going through a cost of living crisis right now. I think it is, quite frankly, outrageous. And I think that's not the only example we had in the paper. There were others who received more than £10,000 as a pay increase in a single year alone. And so I think that just really points out the fact why we need to take a more localised, regionalised basis for pay, so that then these extravagant pay increases can't be given to public sector workers when private sector workers are having to fork out for it and not receiving those pay rises themselves.
Wow, that is quite extraordinary. There's also the DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Somebody got a 20 grand pay increase on the taxpayers. So they must have been very happy as well. But Darwin, thank you so much for joining us and walking us through all of that. Darwin Friend there, who's a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Alliance.